The splash of the Cabernet was silent, but the collective gasp that followed was deafening, instantly killing the hum of the string quartet and freezing the high society gala mid-toast. In the center of the Gothic Grand Hall, Betty Anderson stood paralyzed, deep red wine dripping like fresh blood from her chin onto the pristine light blue of her medical scrubs. A jagged insult about her peasant status hung in the air like a lethal gas, cutting deeper than the wine's stain. Standing over her was Bach Thi, her white satin evening gown shimmering under the chandeliers, her fair face twisted in a mask of arrogant disgust. But no one was looking at the heiress. Every terrified eye was fixed on the man standing like a stone monument behind her. Lan Qui, the Dragon of Seoul, the man whose name was whispered in fear from the back alleys of Incheon to the boardrooms of Los Angeles. Everyone expected Betty to be hauled away by security for soiling the event, but when Lan Qui stepped forward, he didn't reach for his fiancée's hand. He did something that would end their engagement instantly and dismantle the most powerful merger in the city's history. Betty Anderson adjusted the stiff collar of her short-sleeved nurse uniform, feeling the weight of the metal medical tray in her hands. It was 8 p.m. at the Qui Estate, and her lower back was already throbbing, her cheap professional shoes offering little comfort against the cold marble floors. "VIP gala service, Betty. Don't let your clumsy background embarrass this clinic, or you'll be looking for a new city to hide in," hissed the floor supervisor. He was a man whose cruelty was as sharp as his tuxedo, his condescension dripping off him like expensive cologne. "It's the Lan Qui engagement party." Betty's stomach dropped. In her world, you didn't need a newspaper to know who Lan Qui was. He was the high-voltage current running beneath the city's surface, dangerous, untouchable, and lethal. "I've got it. Please, I need this shift. My legal defense retainer is due on Monday," Betty whispered, tucking a rebellious black curl back into her tight, neat bun. She gripped the tray tighter, balancing a vial of rare medication and surgical tools that were meant for a private demonstration, items that cost more than her entire life savings. She took a deep breath. Tonight, she wasn't Dr. Betty Anderson, the elite trauma surgeon framed for malpractice by a billion-dollar medical conglomerate. Tonight, she was a ghost, humble, invisible, silent. She navigated the crowded floor, weaving through the underworld elite and high society moguls. But the atmosphere turned to ice as she approached the center of the hall. Two men in dark suits stood like predators tracking prey, their eyes glowing with the blue light of their earpieces. At the center of it all stood Lan Qui, the Dragon of Seoul, the man whose name was whispered in fear from the back alleys of Incheon to the boardrooms of Los Angeles. The fluorescent lights of the hospital laundry room flickered with a rhythmic, dying hum that mirrored the state of Betty's own spirit. She stood over a mountain of scratchy, bleach-scented linens, her hands that had once navigated the intricate webs of the human cardiovascular system with the precision of a master watchmaker, now raw and pruned from scalding water. Each sheet she folded was a reminder of the life she had lost. 3 years ago, she was the youngest chief of trauma at Metropolitan General, a woman whose surgical instincts were spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. Now she was a shadow in a blue smock, hiding in the peripheral vision of a city that had once hailed her as a hero. The weight of her new life was measured in the cold, clinical letters that arrived at her cramped studio apartment every Tuesday. She could still feel the phantom weight of the most recent one tucked into her bag, a final notice from the legal firm representing the sterling medical conglomerate. The malpractice frame-up had been a masterclass in corporate execution. They hadn't just taken her license, they had buried her under a mountain of engineered debt. $2 million in restitution and legal fees, a sum designed to ensure she would never breathe air that didn't smell like poverty again.
As she worked, her mind drifted to the medical textbooks gathering dust under her bed, their pages yellowing, while her skills stayed sharp in the dark. She often practiced her sutures on oranges by candlelight, her fingers moving with a muscle memory that refused to die. She was a surgeon in exile, a woman who lived in constant fear of a background check or a stray glance from a former colleague. The buzzer for the end of her laundry shift screamed, cutting through her thoughts like a scalpel. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her dark skin pale under the harsh industrial lighting. She had 20 minutes to cross the city, shed the laundry smock, and don the ghost uniform of a gala nurse. It was a high-stakes gamble. The Qui Estate gala was where the elite gathered, the very people who might recognize the face of the disgraced Dr. Anderson. But the debt was a predator, and Monday was the deadline. If she didn't produce the retainer for the one lawyer brave enough to look at her case, the Sterling Group would finalize the permanent revocation of her credentials. She took a deep breath, tucked a loose curl into her tight bun, and stepped out into the biting evening air. She wasn't just going to work a shift, she was walking into a lion's den, desperate for the scraps that might one day buy back her soul.
The rain in Seoul 5 years ago hadn't felt like water. It felt like liquid lead, heavy and cold, washing the neon grit of the city into the gutters of the Mapo-gu back alleys. Betty had been a different woman then, a young surgical fellow on a prestigious exchange program, her coat buttoned high against the damp. She was taking a shortcut back to her hostel, her mind occupied by the day's rounds, when she heard the sound, a wet, ragged wheeze that triggered every medical instinct she possessed. She found him slumped behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. Even in the shadows, Lan Qui was terrifying. He was younger then, his face less a mask of granite and more a map of raw, desperate agony. His hand was clamped over his side, but it was useless. The dark, viscous blood was already pooling on the asphalt, mixing with the rainwater in a sickly swirl. He looked up, and for a split second, Betty saw the dragon before the myth was born, a man looking into the mouth of the void. "No hospital," he had grated out, his voice a jagged rasp that ended in a cough of copper. He gripped a handgun with whitening knuckles, but his strength was fading. "They'll find me. Just leave." Betty didn't leave. She had no equipment, no sterile field, and no legal protection, but she had a sewing kit from her bag and a bottle of high-proof shochu she'd bought for a colleague. She knelt in the muck, her expensive coat instantly ruined by the filth of the alley. With the rain as her only anesthetic and the flickering light of a broken street lamp as her surgical theater, she began the work. She used her scarf as a tourniquet and the shochu to sanitize the blade of a small pocket knife. Every time the thunder rolled, she moved with the precision of a ghost, her fingers dancing through the carnage of his midsection to find the arterial bleeder. He didn't scream. He simply watched her through half-lidded eyes, his gaze burning into hers with a silent, haunting intensity. She worked for 40 minutes in that freezing downpour, her hands steady despite the shivering of her body. When she finally tied the last suture with silk thread, the bleeding stopped. She had vanished before the black sedans arrived to claim him, leaving only a blood-stained scarf and the memory of her steady, dark eyes. She had been his ghost surgeon, the woman who had snatched him back from the Reaper in a place where God didn't look. She had saved the king before he had a throne, never imagining that 5 years later, the debt she had sown in a rain-soaked alley would be the only thing keeping her from her own destruction. The transition from the chaos of the Grand Hall to the interior of the armored limousine was a descent into a world of muffled silence and the scent of aged sandalwood. Betty sat pressed against the cold leather of the rear seat, her heart still erratic, the red wine on her scrubs beginning to feel like a second, heavier skin.
Outside the soundproof glass, the flashes of paparazzi cameras and the confused murmurs of the elite were reduced to a ghostly, irrelevant pantomime. Lan Qui sat in the shadows opposite her, his silhouette sharp against the passing city lights. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar alliance. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered a long-lost prize. Without a word, he opened a sleek black leather folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the console. "The Sterling Medical Conglomerate," he began, his voice a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to hum through the floorboards. "They finalized the paperwork for your permanent debarment at 4 o'clock this afternoon. By 5, they had sold your bundled debt to a third-party collection agency." Betty's breath hitched as she looked at the document. It was a receipt of transfer. "How did you—" "I am that third party, Betty," he interrupted, his eyes meeting hers with a clinical, terrifying focus. "I didn't just find you, I bought you. Every cent of the $2 million you owe is now held by my private holding firm. To the law, you are a disgraced nurse. To the Sterling Group, you are a closed file. But to me, you are a debt that must be repaid." The walls of the limousine seemed to shrink as the reality of his words settled. He had dismantled the legal trap her enemies had set, only to replace it with a cage of his own design. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the man she had once saved in a rain-soaked alley. "You could have just sent a check if you felt you owed me for that night." "A check wouldn't buy the one thing I need to survive the coming months," Lan Qui replied, leaning forward into the sliver of light. "The men I deal with don't fear the law, but they fear death, and I have just secured the only hands capable of keeping it at bay. From this moment on, your safety is my highest priority, because your life belongs to the Qui Estate. You are no longer a nurse hiding in the shadows. You are my ghost surgeon, and I am the only shield standing between you and a prison cell." As the limousine accelerated toward the Hollywood Hills, Betty realized the weight of the wine on her chest was nothing compared to the weight of the gold nib of the pen he was now offering her. She was no longer a victim of a corporate frame-up. She was the property of the dragon. The heavy iron gates of the Qui Estate swung open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a fortress of glass and basalt that loomed against the ink-black sky of the hills. As the limousine came to a halt, the door was opened by a man whose suit was as sharp as his gaze, but Betty barely noticed him. Her eyes were fixed on the structure ahead, a masterpiece of modern architecture that felt less like a home and more like a high-tech mausoleum. Inside, the air was pressurized and chilled to a precise temperature, smelling of ozone and expensive floor wax. Lan Qui led her through a foyer of polished obsidian, his footsteps echoing with a finality that made Betty's chest tighten. She was still wearing the wine-stained scrubs, the fabric now stiff and cold against her skin, a jarring contrast to the minimalist luxury surrounding her. Every few yards, silent men with earpieces stood like statues, their eyes tracking her movement with a clinical detachment that reminded her she was no longer a guest, but a strategic asset. He stopped before a set of double doors guarded by a biometric scanner. "This is the East Wing," Lan Qui said, his voice reflecting off the hard surfaces. "It has been outfitted with a full surgical suite and a private recovery ward. You will find every piece of equipment the Sterling Group took from you, and several they couldn't afford." He pushed the doors open to reveal a room that took Betty's breath away. It was a cathedral of medicine, gleaming robotic arms, top-tier imaging screens, and rows of sterile steel instruments that caught the light like diamonds. For a fleeting second, the surgeon in her felt a surge of pure, uncut adrenaline. But as she stepped inside, she heard the soft clack of the doors locking behind her. She turned to see Lan Qui watching her from the threshold. He didn't enter. "Your old life is dead, Betty. To the world, you've vanished. To me, you are the heart of this house. You have everything you need to practice your craft, but you will not leave these grounds without my express command." She looked at the state-of-the-art monitors and then at the reinforced glass windows that overlooked a sheer cliff. The realization sank in with a cold, heavy thud. He had given her back her scalpel, but he had taken the sky. She was no longer a nurse drowning in debt, and she was no longer a fugitive looking over her shoulder. She was a bird of paradise in a cage of gold and steel, a prisoner of the very man she had once gifted with a second chance at life. She was safe, she was equipped, but as the dragon turned to leave her in her silent sanctuary, she had never felt more alone.
The silence of the East Wing was shattered not by a scream, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots sprinting down the obsidian corridor. Betty had been tracing the edge of a laser-etched scalpel, lost in the sterile perfection of her new prison, when the biometric locks disengaged with a violent snap. The doors swung wide and 4 men burst in, their faces tight with a frantic, disciplined terror. They were carrying a stretcher, and even from across the room, the metallic, cloying scent of fresh trauma hit Betty like a physical blow. "Doctor, now!" one of the men barked, his suit jacket shredded and soaked through with a deep, encroaching crimson. On the stretcher lay a young man, barely 20, his skin the color of dampened ash. His tactical vest had been sliced away, revealing a jagged, sucking chest wound that whistled with every agonizing gasp. This wasn't a clinical demonstration, this was a battlefield. Behind the soldiers, Lan Qui stepped into the room. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were fixed on Betty, cold, expectant, and challenging. He was testing the ghost surgeon he had bought, looking to see if the nurse's scrubs had finally suffocated the doctor's soul. Betty felt the old, familiar electricity spark at the base of her skull. The hum of the laundry room and the sting of the wine splash vanished, replaced by the tunnel vision of the operating theater. She didn't wait for permission. She moved before she could think, her hands finding the patient's pulse with a speed that startled the guards. "Prep the bypass. I need a chest tube, 10 gauge, and a thoracotomy tray, now!" Her voice rang out, no longer a whisper of a disgraced servant, but the command of a general. The estate's private medical team, accustomed to treating minor scrapes and luxury ailments, hesitated. They looked at her blue scrubs, then at the dark-skinned woman barking orders in their pristine sanctuary. "Don't look at me!" Lan Qui's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do exactly what she says, or you won't live to see the sunrise." The room erupted into motion. Betty felt the familiar weight of the surgical mask against her face, the snap of the latex gloves against her wrists. As she made the first incision, the steel slicing through the skin with practiced grace, the world outside the East Wing ceased to exist. There was no debt, no frame-up, and no golden cage. There was only the anatomy, the blood, and the fierce, undeniable power of a woman reclaiming her throne at the edge of a blade. Under the shadow of the dragon, the surgeon had returned. The heavy silence of the surgical suite was broken the next afternoon by the sharp, rhythmic click of stiletto heels against the obsidian floors of the corridor. Betty was meticulously cleaning her instruments, the rhythmic clink of stainless steel providing a meditative comfort when the biometric doors were forced open. Bach Thi stood in the threshold, no longer the weeping bride from the gala, but a woman rearmed in a suit of razor-sharp tailoring and a coat of winter-white fur. Her fair skin was flawless, her long brown hair styled in waves that seemed to catch every sliver of the estate's artificial light, but her eyes were cold, darting around the medical sanctuary with a mixture of envy and disgust. She didn't speak immediately. She simply walked the perimeter of the room, her fingertips trailing over the millions of dollars in equipment that Lan Qui had bought for a lowly nurse. "So this is where the help hides when she isn't spilling wine?" Bach Thi finally said, her voice a melodic poison that echoed off the sterile walls.
She stopped in front of Betty, her gaze dropping to the blue scrubs that had been freshly laundered but remained a symbol of Betty's servitude. My father and Lan Qui have a partnership that spans decades. You, however, are a temporary curiosity, a black market fix for a man who has grown bored with perfection. Betty didn't flinch. She placed a tray of forceps down with a steady hand, her expressive eyes meeting Bach Thi's sharp stare. I am here because I can do what no one else in this city can, Betty replied, her voice low and clinical. Status won't restart a heart, and a dowry won't stop an arterial bleed. Bach Thi laughed, a sound as brittle as breaking glass. You think your skills make you indispensable? I've spent the morning speaking with my contacts at the Sterling Medical Group. They were quite helpful. They told me about the ghost surgeon who fled the country after a patient died on her table. They told me about the millions you owe in blood money. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the ozone of the medical suite. Lan Qui doesn't keep broken things, Betty. He just uses them until they shatter. I'm going to make sure he remembers exactly how damaged you are before the sun sets tonight. She turned on her heel, her white coat billowing like a shroud. As the doors hissed shut behind her, the room felt suddenly colder. Betty looked down at her hands, the hands that had saved the king, and saw them trembling for the first time. The dragon's shield was strong, but the woman he had discarded was now weaving a different kind of trap, one that surgical precision alone could not cut through. The following evening, the tension within the estate had thickened into something suffocating, a precursor to a storm that Betty could feel in the very marrow of her bones. She was resting in the small lounge adjacent to the surgical suite when Bach Thi appeared once more. This time, the heiress was not wielding insults, but a delicate silver tray carrying 2 porcelain cups of steaming jasmine tea. Her expression was a masterclass in calculated contrition, a soft, practiced humility that didn't quite reach her predatory eyes. Lan Qui believes I was too harsh, Bach Thi murmured, setting the tray on the low obsidian table. She moved with a fluid, serpentine grace, pushing 1 cup toward Betty. He values your service, and in this house what he values I must tolerate. Consider this a gesture of peace. The scent of the jasmine was aggressive, nearly cloying, but as the steam hit Betty's face, her internal diagnostic alarm began to chime. Years of studying toxicology and the subtle chemistry of the body had sharpened her senses into a razor's edge. Beneath the floral top notes of the tea, there was a faint metallic undertone, the scent of almond and bitter cherry that didn't belong in a premium blend. Betty watched the way Bach Thi's gaze remained fixed on the cup, her fingers twitching slightly against the silk of her skirt. The heiress wasn't waiting for a conversation, she was waiting for a swallow. Betty leaned in, ostensibly to blow on the hot liquid, but her eyes were tracking the viscosity of the tea. It was slightly too thick, a subtle syrupiness that indicated a high concentration of succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic often used in surgeries, but lethal in a domestic setting. It wouldn't kill instantly, it would simply freeze the muscles, turning the victim's own body into a tomb while they remained fully conscious. It's a rare blend, Bach Thi urged, her voice a silk thread of anticipation. Betty lifted the cup, her hand steady, the surgeon's mask of calm firmly in place. It's fascinating, Betty said, her voice clinical and cold. Most people wouldn't notice the change in the tea's surface tension, but then again, most people aren't trained to spot the signs of respiratory failure before it begins. She didn't drink. Instead, she stood and walked toward a potted orchid in the corner, pouring the amber liquid into the soil. Within seconds, the vibrant petals began to curl and darken. Betty turned back to see Bach Thi's face draining of its fair color, the mask of the refined bride shattering to reveal the desperate monster beneath. "You should be careful, Bach Thi," Betty whispered, leaning over the table until she was inches from the woman's face. "You're playing with medicine now, and in this room I am the only one who knows the antidote." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the biometric doors sliding open and the heavy rhythmic tread of Lan Qui approaching from the shadows.
The morning following the tea incident, the East Wing was stripped of its clinical isolation. Under Lan Qui's direct oversight, the blue scrubs that had served as Betty's armor and shroud were gathered and burned, replaced by a wardrobe of structured silks and tailored wools in shades of deep emerald, midnight, and the rich, dark red of the wine that had started it all. The transformation was not merely aesthetic, it was a formal restructuring of the estate's hierarchy. Lan Qui assembled the entire household staff and his inner circle of captains in the obsidian foyer. His voice, usually a low growl, carried a frightening clarity that brooked no dissent. "The woman standing beside me is no longer a guest, and she was never a servant," he announced, his hand resting with proprietary weight on Betty's shoulder. "Dr. Anderson is the general of life in this house. Her word is my command. If she marks a man for salvation, he lives. If she identifies a threat, it is removed. You will accord her the same loyalty and the same fear you offer me." For Betty, the transition was a grueling immersion into a world where every gesture was a tactical move. While her hands remained sharp for surgery, she spent her afternoons under the tutelage of Lan Qui's most trusted advisors, learning the language of the dragon. She was taught to walk not like a nurse avoiding notice, but like a woman who owned the ground beneath her. She learned the nuances of Mafia etiquette, how to identify the subtle hierarchy of a dinner table, how to read the hidden aggression in a bow, and how to maintain a mask of porcelain indifference while her mind performed a diagnostic scan of the room. Her nursing background, once a source of shame, became her secret weapon. She realized that the underworld was much like a trauma ward, filled with hidden bleeds and silent infections. She began to see the stains on the people around her, the nervous tick of a bodyguard, the dilated pupils of a captain who was far too eager to please, the slight tremor in the hands of those who harbored secrets. By the end of the week, the poor nurse had vanished entirely. In her place stood a woman who looked at the world with the cold, calculating eye of a surgeon and the lethal poise of a queen. She moved through the basalt corridors of the estate with a quiet, terrifying grace, no longer apologizing for taking up space. She was a weapon forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by Lan Qui's ambition. The cage was still made of gold, but Betty had realized that a bird with a sharp enough beak doesn't just sing, it waits for the right moment to strike. The final meeting was held in the underground war room, a space of brushed steel and flickering monitors that felt more like a high-stakes surgical theater than a boardroom. Betty sat at Lan Qui's right hand, her emerald silk dress a sharp contrast to the black tactical gear of the captains surrounding them. She remained silent, her gaze not on the maps of the city's shipping docks, but on the bodies of the men who controlled them. To the captains, she was a trophy. To Lan Qui, she was a human lie detector. As the discussion turned to the recent ambush on the convoy, Betty began her diagnostic scan. She didn't listen to their words, she watched their physiology. She tracked the carotid arteries for a telltale throb and the erratic rise and fall of chest cavities. Her eyes eventually locked onto Captain Lan Qui, the man who had been loudest in his calls for a bloody retaliation against the Yakuza. While Lan Qui gestured toward the digital map, Betty noticed the slight rhythmic tremor in his right hand, the hand he kept partially tucked beneath the mahogany table. As he reached for a glass of water, the sleeve of his tailored blazer shifted, revealing a thin, silver line of raised tissue on the back of his hand. It was a Z-plasty incision scar,
a very specific surgical technique used to repair deep tendon lacerations, a specialty of the Sterling Medical Group's private surgical wing. Betty leaned in, her voice cutting through Sung Ki's aggressive speech with the cold precision of a scalpel. "That's an impressive recovery, Captain," she remarked, her eyes fixed on his wrist. "The Sterling Group doesn't usually perform that level of reconstructive surgery on accidental kitchen wounds. It's more common for injuries sustained while handling the high-tension wire traps the Yakuza are so fond of." The room went deathly silent. Sung Ki's hand froze mid-air. Betty didn't wait for him to recover. She stood and walked behind him, her fingers finding the pulse point at his neck before he could pull away. 140 beats per minute, she announced to the room, her voice devoid of emotion. "Your heart is betraying you, Sung Ki. It's a classic sympathetic nervous system response to a perceived threat." Lan Qui didn't need to hear more. He stood slowly, his shadow falling over the trembling captain. The poor nurse had found the infection that the dragon's enforcers had missed. She wasn't just his doctor anymore, she was the architect of his survival. As the guards moved in, Betty returned to her seat, her face a mask of obsidian calm. She had once been framed for a death she didn't cause, but tonight she had used her medical genius to deliver a final clinical verdict. Under the cold lights of the war room, the transformation was complete. The ghost surgeon had become the dragon's most lethal judge.
The dragon has found his queen, but the war for the city has only just begun. If you enjoyed this journey from the hospital laundry room to the inner sanctum of the Mafia, you won't want to miss what happens next. The betrayal of Captain Sang Qui is only the first thread to unspool, and Bach Thi's jealousy is far from extinguished. Part 2 is coming soon. To see how Betty navigates her new power and whether she can finally clear her name against the Sterling Medical Group, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support and subscriptions are the only way we can continue to bring these high-stakes, cinematic stories to life. Let us know in the comments what you think Betty's next move should be. Subscribe now to stay tuned for the next chapter of the Ghost Surgeon's reign.